What up, world? Soweto Kinch broadcasting live for the lockdown sessions. Believe it or not, this is week 12. Can't believe we've had 12 shows already. And yeah, lots of time to reflect, to build new links, new connections, for new creativity, new creative possibilities. But today is a very interesting day. It's a very interesting moment in terms of where we are, society, in terms of inequality, if you like, being exposed. And if you're one of the tiny handful of people who have no idea what the backdrop is that I'm sitting in front of, it's the anniversary, 3-year anniversary of Grenfell. A lot of people might not know, but I went to primary school in Ladbroke Grove, a tiny place called Oxford Gardens, which was right next door to Grenfell. Grew up in that area, went to nursery and primary school, and what was a heavily West Indian, Moroccan area has obviously been incredibly gentrified. There's been a lot of changes. But Grenfell was the most obvious reminder that there are two Englands, if you like, two Londons, two Great Britons, and how in the richest borough that such an obvious injustice could happen is still grating. Even today, some 8 families have still not been rehoused after the incident, called an incident, after what was a case of criminal negligence, frankly. So I'm going to start by playing a clip from one of the survivors of Grenfell, somebody who's been really articulate, a resident himself who was caught up and also wrote in the Residents Association to them, warning them about this possibility of fire months before it actually happened. But he says something very interesting about the position that we have as renters, particularly now in this post-COVID-19 world. So let's have a listen to what my man has to say. Or not. Okay. I hope it's not going to be one of these technical, crazy shows with lots of bogeys and that, but let's hope not. I'm going to try and drop that in again and hope that my computer doesn't be stupid. Not now. A word from the Grenfell resident.
It's taken quite a toll, not just on those who were affected that night, but I mean the local community that has been affected every night ever since, you know, and it's not just them who are affected, you know, it's also people who are in blocks across the country which have questionable materials on them. It really is an emotional toll that is very, very, it's very, very grating. It wears away at you. Sadly, that's why we've seen so many in our community who've had mental health issues or other health problems, or, you know, have even gone as far as, you know, taking their own life on occasion.
The public inquiry is due to restart. It would have restarted, wouldn't it, but for coronavirus. Do you have confidence that when it does, things will move forward?
I was very impressed with Sir Martin Morbick's first report, but frankly, I have no more faith in the inquiry process now because of the immunity that's been granted to the corporates that are participating. And we didn't need these people to have immunity in order to know these things, because we knew them already from the documentary evidence that was there. We seem to be rather sadly following the paths of the victims of Hillsborough at the moment. And, you know, their tragic journey has taken them 30 years so far and they've still not seen justice. And I fear now that, you know, we have set ourselves on a similar course.
What, therefore, is your message to all those other people, as you mentioned, up and down the country, who are living in buildings where they're not sure what's on the outside, or they know what's on the outside and they're scared of what's on the outside?
If your landlord or if your freeholder in your building is not fixing matters for you, don't pay them rent. Don't pay service charges. Hold it all. You know, hold it all in an escrow account. Get together with all of your neighbours. They can't evict all of you at once. You know, it's collectively that we can win this. You know, one voice does nothing. You know, but one voice in a chorus, that, you know, it can burst eardrums. It can be that loud.
Talk that shit, bro. This is the only time really that collective action could be affected with such, you know, uniformity. The fact that we're already on lockdown, so many people are on furlough, the fact that they've given mortgage holidays to people but not renters holidays should all leave us pretty incensed, because, and it's something that we're going to talk about in the interview later, there is a massive crisis on the way in terms of the conditions and the situation for renters. So the idea that we could just withhold our rent until we actually have decent dwellings, habitable dwellings. The reason that we don't have them is because well over 60% of Parliament are private landlords, and they vote against the Habitable Dwellings Act every time it's brought before Commons. So this is time for new action, not just talking about radicalism, but actually doing it. And hopefully we're starting to see the ways in which Carillion, Grenfell, this COVID-19 crisis, Charles de Menezes, violence from the police, violence from the state against ordinary people, austerity deaths, COVID deaths, all of these things are interrelated. And yes, even the statue of Edward Colston, because in my opinion, white supremacy is the underpinning of it all. The idea that just a bunch of brown people, predominantly or working class white people, could die in this tower while rich, commodious dwellings in the rest of Kensington and Chelsea are absolutely fine. And yeah, they returned a Conservative minister at the last general election. I'm going to move on though to Brother Chappelle. If you haven't seen Dave Chappelle's 846, it's probably the most cathartic thing to watch right now for me. It's one of those things, much like seeing Edward Colston's statue topple, one of those things I didn't know I needed to see until I saw it. So this is one of my favorite clips. There's so many I've just lifted from the Netflix special.
Why would anyone keep my mouth shut? But don't think that my silence is complicit of all the shit these niggas are saying, trying to get everyone to sing these fucking songs. I know all these songs. I was raised on these songs. Why would anyone care what their favorite comedian thinks after they saw a police officer kneel on a man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds? I can't get that number out of my head because it was my time of birth on my birth certificate. I was born at 8:46 in the morning, and they killed this nigga in 8 minutes and 46 seconds. I watch everything everybody says. I think Candace Owens try to convince white America, don't worry about it, he's a criminal anyway. I don't give a fuck what this nigga did. I don't care what this nigga did. I don't care if he personally kicked Candace Owens in her stinky pussy.
He's raw with it, man. Coming out with it. And I think the use of the N-word and the B-word throughout the piece is actually quite deliberate. There's a thing of inside and outside voices. The N-word is something that's not really part of my black British culture or West Indian culture, but in America it signifies, as does the B-word, that we're talking amongst family. And he's allowing the camera lens in to video that. I think he's somebody who's very deliberate in the things that he plants in people's minds, the very deep critiques that he makes, and that is definitely worth seeing. But the thing that hits me as a musician is this thing of come and sing the songs in the church and all these church ceremonies. Now look, I understand the need to worship, definitely. I understand the need to give George Floyd the right sort of send-off. But the spectacle of black people prostrate, screaming, wailing, singing, rather than seeking justice is something that I'm pretty sick of. And it relates back to the time in 2007 that we'll get into in a lot more detail later. But the idea that black people should somehow apologize or forgive injustices, rank injustices that are done to them. I'm tired of it. And we want to pray for the fact that we just got shot in the face again. And it's on the Channel 4 news, on ITV. Every single news channel will report another black service. It's part of the ritual, sadly, of taking our own culture and using it to enslave us with. That's my opinion. But yeah, it's been a crazy, crazy mad week. And I was really lucky to get blessed to have an interview with Toyin Agbetu, who is an incredible activist. If any of you don't know why I'm such a fan of his or how he came to prominence with Legally.org, it's the fact that in 2007, when Britain should have really been sensibly discussing reparations and how we could reframe the economic arguments around the end of slavery, instead they refused to say sorry. And in a strangely juju-esque spiritual ritual, decided to get Africans into Westminster Abbey to perform sort of weird sacraments and bow before the Queen and Tony Blair and say they're sorry, whilst Tony Blair and the Queen wouldn't say sorry. So yeah, I'm gonna be talking to Toyin very shortly in an interview that we recorded yesterday. But that way in which, if you like, spirituality, juju, witchcraft, for want of a better term, is used to keep everybody stupefied, I think is another thing that's behind the Edward Colston statue. Who are all these statues of people? I don't even know their names, but ordinary people walk past them every day and think, that's what power looks like. And you'll never look like that, so you'll never have power. Crazy world, huh? So yeah, man, it's been, as I said, a crazy week. A lot been going on. There was the fantastic demonstrations on Saturday, and the Britianists out there who can't even spell Britain and clearly have wet their trousers have really shown up what I think the state of the new Tory voter, if you like, is. The fact that I raised that on Twitter has drawn up some ire, but there's a lot of very weird stuff happening on Twitter. If you're not on it, I wouldn't necessarily say to be on it, because it's addictive and you don't necessarily have the most accurate perception of the world, but here you go. David Baddiel, centrist scourge of all Corbynistas, supposedly a left-winger, is doing all this performative allyship that just sickens me, frankly. Here he is talking about fascists in Italy 1 second, and talking about those protesters, those working class counter-protesters who are the C word. Let's not even get into maybe the misogyny in that word. I do like the C word, frankly, but hey. And here we go again, one more. What do these wankers actually want? Because David Baddiel isn't a wanker. However, nowhere on his Twitter profile or on his website or in public have I seen him apologize for this. All throughout the 90s, this was a feature of his football stuff with Frank Skinner, who, frankly, thankfully, didn't do any blackface like this. But to blackface up every week to ridicule a black footballer and to not own it, to sort of be part of this firmament that suggests that black people are the ones who are angry about Churchill and Little Britain and Fawlty Towers. No, it's not us. It's you who are being exposed. And Matt Lucas and David Walliams, I think, just did the right thing by saying, yeah, we shouldn't have done that. The fact that this guy hasn't done it, well, there you go. It kind of makes a mockery of all of his attempts to call Labour Party members anti-Semites and racists when he hasn't even owned something as obvious and as findable as that. But I digress. Oh, I'm going to have to get into that picture related to that very, very shortly. It's also been an interesting time for Neil Oliver, a historian, a television historian. You learn things about people that you didn't throughout this crisis, right? I just thought he was an affable, an amiable historian, but always wondered on his things of like BBC Coast programs why he never covers slavery at all, or even talks about any notable black people within history, maybe because he doesn't know about them. But yeah, here he is springing to the defense of Edward Colston, and thankfully Twitter has informed me that this guy's not even a historian. He's not even a qualified historian, just somebody who's on telly. I mean, talk about white privilege, right? But he has access to every British living room on telly with 17th century hair, which is about all I can see that qualifies him to do history. And behold, this wonderful chap, who apparently has been picked up, I think, in Essex. But decry it as they may, the new Tory government need to recognise that I'll bet money on it, this guy's a Tory voter. I'll literally stake a sack throne on it. This guy voted Tory in the last general election. And the idea of trying to demonise Black Lives Matter and stimulate some weird culture war is clearly backfiring. And it's beautiful to see. But yeah, as I said, people started berating me for saying these guys are Tory voters. Well, let's have a listen to what Britain First Leader himself, or read of what Britain First Leader himself said. You can look this up yourself, but Paul What's-His-Face basically says we want to be the sort of entryist bloc that make the Conservative Party what it is today. We love Boris Johnson because he's one of us. And the signifiers in all of this, Boris Johnson only today has said, we want you to stop feeling like victims. We want to change the narrative around victimhood. Not we want to institute justice for all the crimes and horrible misdeeds of British history. But there we go. I want to get into this whole Jess Phillips, Karen-like world for a little while. We've got 3 people up in the comments. Please feel free to remark either negatively or positively. All your remarks are useful, man. They're always great to hear. But yeah, this Karen thing, if you like, has a very, very long history. And I'd certainly advise you, if you get the time, to go and check out an incredible YouTube stream by someone I'm a massive fan of, Professor Joy Leary, if I can find the screen here. Yeah, this is something that's worth checking out on YouTube, called Karen Needs to Go to Jail, Part 1. It's in 2 parts, a history of dangerous white behavior. And this isn't to really inflect any misogyny into the conversation. It's to really look at how white femininity has often been used as a tool to extend white supremacy, and it's well worth checking out. It's notable when you've seen J.K. Rowling's almost piping up to silence black trans voices, and notably in Jess Phillips using her femininity to almost try and berate or distract us from what the issue of justice is that's happening right now. What about women? You think the far right could never have targeted women? Check out fan fiction about them killing my kids or deep fake. Jess, it's not about you. George Floyd, it's not about you. The pulling down of Edward Colston and all this. So the idea of crowbarring, much as Priti Patel did, crowbarring her experiences of being called the P word as a child to sort of silence the current demands for justice, are very transparent. But let me just point out that they have a very long history. This is Caroline Bryant, the infamous Caroline Bryant. This is the woman who told on Emmett Till. The woman who said that he whistled at me and flirted with me. And if you don't know the Emmett Till story, it's going to horrify you, but please do Google it if you haven't heard of it before, in which a 14-year-old boy was brutally beaten, murdered and thrown into a river on this evidence. This was the only evidence that convicted him of a horrible beating, lynching and drowning. What kills me is that Caroline Bryant admitted, as you can see, she tells historians her claims were false. She made the whole thing up. And yet, she never went to jail. Caroline Bryant passed away at 72 on February the 19th, 2017, so just 3 years ago. Never got punished, never had any recriminations for lying and basically murdering a 14-year-old. That is the problem, the thing I have a problem with. So let's go into this picture. This isn't to belittle, I don't want anyone to get the wrong impression, belittle the very serious issue of anti-Semitism in Britain, let alone in the Labour Party. I think the idea of making it a specific Labour problem is problematic in itself. But even more problematic is this optic of 3 white women claiming they are the victims of racism and using it to get Mark Wadsworth expelled, to get a black man expelled. These trials, these proceedings were never opened up for us as an audience to make our own decisions. There wasn't exactly a level playing field to appraise these things, just the testimony of 3 white women. And that in itself should be problematic for all white female allies, for everybody who can see that this isn't necessarily the best way to deal justice. So yeah, man, please check out Karen Needs to Go to Jail. But finally, before I stop talking and get into some music before this interview and stuff, another incident that I had with a Karen, I don't know what the word for Karen is in Italian, was this infamous moment that I had at a pizza place, Antica, I think it was called, in Baker Street. I've been there a couple of times with white friends to eat pizza, but this particular day, the woman at reception, if you like, at the door, decided that I wasn't going to get served, that I was a threat, that, and in the end of this exchange, I didn't even get to place an order. I was physically ejected from a restaurant before I could even place an order for pizza. But I had an epiphany. This was about 10 days ago when I made my first homemade pizza during lockdown. Man, it was delish, if I may say so. Bellissimo. I don't know if it would pass the test from like most Italians, but frankly, I thought it was probably the best pizza I've ever made. Maybe the only pizza I've ever made, but it was delicious. The point being, well, where we are, having to cook for ourselves, perhaps eating takeaways less, is actually an opportunity to ask ourselves, why was I spending all that money? From one lump of pizza dough, I made about 8 pizzas, and I could add whatever I wanted to them, basil, anchovies. It's quite a fitting metaphor for where we are as a country and as an economy. All the things that we're not spending money on at the moment, all the shops that we're not gratuitously wasting money in at the moment have made us realize that maybe we can repair old clothes. All these bonfires, I keep mentioning them, bonfires that I'm smelling and seeing, all these skips that I'm seeing, suggest that we've just got too much stuff and we need to get rid of it. And this pizza incident for me just shows me like how the economy could shape up after this. It's probably no surprise to you, but the government's been gingerly trying to encourage us back to work with stories like, it's patriotic to go shopping. How can you not shop? Maybe what Britain needs is for you to shop to get back on its feet. All stuff I find absolutely ridiculous. But what's coming through is the idea that there isn't an economy without suckers like you and me to go out and do the jobs that nobody else wants to do, or to go out and waste money on stuff. Consumerism seems to be the underpinning of this entire economy, and that can't work. You know what I mean? So I'm not going to talk anymore for about 5 minutes or so. I'm going to play an assortment of my favorite songs and then get into this incredible interview I have with Toyin Agbetu. So without any further ado, check it out. Hey, yo.
Never seen a truer color in the sewers, gutters, who has cut us loose and who is losing trust. Just assume they want us to resume with Satan, throw us in the face of danger while remunerating. Your stable genius, his brain's a penis. Your deep thinker's a bleach drinker. No way, serious. Brexit flag and exit planning while we're still on stretchers hanging. Ventilators dragging, Valentine's addressed to mammon. Foreigner despising, pocket lining, profit hiking, and lobotomizing anyone who prophesied it. Heads in investments, credit bonds, better lives away. Hegemon, bowed heads before the hegemon. Lives wasted, discarded for blind faith in the market. In a car wreckage, looking for ways to restart it. Stigmatized, ill-equipped, the sick and dying. Deaf to the deaf, but herd immunizing. Sick of fancy, sick of answers, sick of Deliveroo living, sitting in taxis, plan to leave us sicker with the vaccine. Power praising, craving, cowards counterclaiming, thrown us in the overcrowded housing, leaves us sour tasting. Protecting sectors, never in protective vests and medics, and just sent them in with empty gestures. Fake preaching, labor leaking, weaponizing, secret hate speech and racist feeding. Hoarding trinkets, gorging, misreporting, inconvenient stats ignoring, we can see it all recorded. Opportunists jacking prices, casualties ain't stacked up right. Wait, the true colours might be black and white. Messengers shooting, deflecting questions, wedded to weapons and fuel, and considered a few deaths a solution. information exchange. The microphone sounds a bit strange. Alright, 1, 2, low. On the microphone with a cool flow. Yeah, we spit well. Enough respect to the survivors of Grenfell. When all the people sitting at home, we're spitting freestyle straight from the dome. Make sure that you're doing it. We're here to make music and not ruin it. Yeah, the flow will be doper. Big up to my bro, son, he's called Zosa. He's always bringing that fire. From the young to the old that inspire. Gonna get a bit higher. I ain't made a mistake, no tripwire. That's what's up. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have enjoyed the show thus far. It's been wide-ranging. A lot of things, as I said, going through my head at this time. But I think the main one, and it's something that we'll deal with in the interview, is abuse. Like what abusive relationships look like, those up close, those interpersonal ones, and how those map on to the things that we see in a wider society. If anyone has the misfortune to have been or is currently in an abusive relationship, you probably would have seen how lockdown would have exacerbated it, made it worse. So, you know, compassionately, I want to encourage you in this time that it won't continue forever. But that relates very specifically to everything that we see with race relations, race issues, right? We're talking about, as Dave Chappelle expressed so eloquently in 846, nearly 9 minutes of torture, suffocation, all the thoughts that go through your mind, and that level of cruelty and inhumanity that is endured by that. And yet we're here talking about statues, as though anybody really cares about faulty towers, as though any black people who have complained for years, decades, in fact, a whole century, as though we really care about, Basil Fawlty. That's not the case. And it's something that abusers do. You know, they'll say, well, what have you done? What about the shoes that you're wearing? Or what about your hair? Why didn't you learn to take a punch more adequately? Anything to sort of rile you up, gaslight you, and get you to forget about the fundamental injustice, to try and divert your attention away from their abuse. And I've got to say, we've got to keep our eyes firmly on it, so that Boris Johnson isn't allowed to talk about changing the narrative, in his words. I think that means running away from scrutiny, in plain speak, in normal English. But yeah, man, we got ourselves a fire interview in the way. Big up my brother, Francis Mott, another incredibly talented artist, man. I'm sure we're gonna be doing some big things during this lockdown, you know what I mean? And I just want to encourage you that what's happening now is the abuse, if you like, being exposed. It's just out in the open. You've encountered it in your workplace. You've seen the Karen-like dynamics and, you know, friends and your workplace as well. You've seen all of this abuse for decades, and now this is actually cathartic, because what's being corroborated is that you're not crazy, you're not making it up, and you're watching the unraveling, if you like, of an establishment who don't know how to respond to injustice because they're all implicated in it. So yeah, I'm gonna get straight into this incredible interview that I had with this brother from Legali, Mr. Toyin Agbetu. And as mentioned, if you weren't around in 2007, this man stood up in the middle of Westminster Abbey, defying all of the centuries-old conventions about decorum in a place like Westminster Abbey, and stood up and said it was shameful. What they'd done in 2007, the attempting really through symbols and jargon and doublespeak to re-enslave us mentally, to make Africans apologize for the slave trade and to never pay any reparations. Well, that was a despicable act. And thanks to him, he stood up, but demonstrated something to me that's far more long-lasting and particularly relevant now, that your courage in these moments, your courage in these times, will make you, I'll say it, will make you a hero. I'm not going to be here pontificating saying people shouldn't riot or should riot or what they should say, what they should do, but don't let a fear or a lack of courage or some abusive nutcase around you stop you from doing what you're supposed to do. That's enough sermonizing. I hope that you're all right. As Dave Chappelle said, am I boring you? Here comes, another incredible interview. I don't want to say it's my favorite because Zosa's still here in the group. It's almost as good as the one last week. If I can find it, it's coming up. And it features Toyin Agbetu from an organization called Legali. Here it comes. It's like, a mixture of feeling enclosed and imprisoned by the circumstances, but it's also really cathartic. Like seeing that statue crash into the river, seeing just a lot of people exposed, seeing what happened yesterday in the march and all that as well. It's just like, you see, you're not crazy. Like, this is what Britain really is, a bunch of racist louts in many places. And we're not crazy. Like, these symbols, I felt like a spiritual weight come off me. It's not the first time I've heard people say it. Like, just, it's almost a form of juju, these statues and emblems and whatnot.
No, that's exactly. I think you've nailed it perfectly, because that's exactly what it does. It's a form of oppression. It's a spiritual oppression. People don't think it means anything, but what it does, it empowers those who keep the statues alive. Keep them there, so they feel like, you know what, we can put this in your face and know that we're always above you, and it keeps us down. Right, so we know that we're being mocked and that we're being, they're taking the mick out of us. Yeah. And we can't do anything about it. So that statue coming down was beautiful. I mean, especially when it went into the water. Oh my gosh, that was like.
Yeah, it's one of them things you don't know you needed to see until you see it. You know what I mean? Like, oh yeah, it's really powerful. For me, one of the most powerful symbolic moments of the past 20 years, frankly, and one that was never really gotten to grips with, was when you, bro, stood up in Westminster Abbey in 2007. It was seismic, and even though there were lots of different people shifting to try and make sense of it afterwards, I think anybody who was in the knowledge of what happened in the Martha, in the knowledge of what happened during slavery, was incredibly moved by what happened. But what was that like, being in Westminster Abbey in 2007, knowing full well you're about to be seized by employees of the Crown, with all of that symbolism, that juju, if you like, around you? How did you pluck up the courage, and what was it like to actually do it?
Wow. Well, thank you for the kind words. Even now, when I think about it, it kind of takes me back. It was a very, I don't know how to explain it. Apart from that, it's a very spiritual movement. It's a very spiritual vibe inside me. I mean, I'm Yoruba, Ogun spirit, so I'm aware of my ability and not to allow myself to be triggered, not allow myself that fiery part of me to come out. And so I was actually there in a capacity of my organisation. I was actually reporting on the proceedings because I actually thought something symbolic was going to happen. I thought that they were going to make an apology. It was the first time that the monarch, that the Prime Minister, the church was all there under this guise. And I thought, actually, I have to call this for my people. I don't even want to be in this place, but something's got to happen. They're going to apologise. And that's something our ancestors will be proud of. And then, you're reading the programme and it's telling you, right, scripted, this is a time you go down on your knees and you've got to pray to God for forgiveness.
So just to clarify, the Africans were asked, the descendants of Africans in this church were asked to apologise for being enslaved.
Yeah, to beg God's forgiveness. I mean, it was a kind of ritual, and I read it, and my spirit just said, "You can't be here. How would I be able to go home? How could I go home to my children and them say to me, Daddy, why did you apologise for enslaving our ancestors and us and keep?" I couldn't do that. So it was kind of like even though all this oppression was around me, even though I knew that I was in great danger, that was nothing compared to the fact that I had to leave. It's kind of like, I don't know, I just had to leave. And that's the situation. And sometimes there are things that are bigger than you, the individual. There are some things that, if your life means that you're being clear that some things are just wrong, then so be it. And
the beautiful thing about that moment as well is that you really forced the establishment's hand. You really showed their hand, if you like, because the legalese importance of them not saying sorry, not being able to say sorry, and the fact that you're calling them to account in Westminster Abbey saying, say sorry, not express a statement of deep regret, which is what they did. And these sort of legalese reasons, the precedent reasons why they didn't do that are coming to a head again. He didn't say sorry because they would have had to pay reparations, right? And why do you think that is still such a sensitive issue for the establishment? How do you think that they managed to avoid that important question even today?
Well, I mean, the first thing is that I actually didn't ask them to say sorry. I just said, there's something wrong with you if you can't say sorry. If you hurt someone, if you're involved in an injustice and you can't actually apologize for it, as this nation is still in that same space, then you are emotionally stunted. Your moral compass is somehow still off kilter. So the point I was making is, what's wrong with you? Why can't you say sorry? Why can't you apologize? Because, of course, that's something that the Germans did when they recognized the atrocities that they'd carried out. And I'm not saying they're perfect, but they have moved forward on dealing and making atonement for some of their crimes to humanity. Britain has never done so, still hasn't done so, as we're seeing now what's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement. They still refuse to do so. On a legal term, part of making an apology is part of accepting that there's a need to reparate. There's a need to repair the harm that you've done. And because Britain is still stuck, and I'm talking about the institutions of Britain, not all the British people, obviously, but institutions of Britain are still engaged in putting profit before people. They're still thinking in the sense of like, well, if we apologise, it is a legal issue, it's a contractual, we've agreed to the fact that we committed this crime, and then therefore we're going to have to pay, or we're going to, and they see reparations purely as money. And of course, reparations to anyone who's kind of like got any kind of emotional centre will know that reparations goes far beyond money. What's happening right now is part of the reparations movement. We're not talking about its reparations, but taking down the statues, renaming this is all reparations. It's that we're forcing it on the government, as opposed to the government reaching a place of emotional maturity to say, you know what, we've reached an epiphany. Rather than us follow down the same lines of what's happening in America and getting as bad as what, I mean, I'm not saying it's not bad here already, it is, but with the guns on the streets and everything like that, rather than get to that point there where police stations are being burnt down, let us emotionally develop ourselves and start taking these acts already. And you can see the nation's not ready for that, because yesterday there was a bunch of like racist thugs in Parliament who were actually giving Nazi salutes.
I find this moment again really interesting. There was another moment yesterday in this argument between two white people, I guess various shades of the right. Some say all lives matter, white lives matter. Because they didn't know what they were arguing about. It was just kind of compelled out there by a bunch of dog whistles from the government about Churchill and defend your statues. And I have this powerful feeling that they're not the racists I'm concerned with at all. Like, if anything, they probably are misguided allies, just completely lost. The real racists are those that filter these images, these ideas from the establishment. Somehow, Nelson's column is a stand-in for your otherwise flaccid. You know what I mean? People are. I think it has a lot to do with it, man. I'm going to come out and say it. The sexual insecurities in this country, the loss of agency, the emasculation, that somehow racism can fill that void. And I'm more concerned, how do we nip those racists in the bud? The ones that filter those images amongst the populace. How do we get to the economics? Because we're debating statues and a bunch of diversionary stuff, as opposed to how do we hit these people in their pockets? Any suggestions you have in that?
That's the harder work. That's the first thing you've got to do, and we as collective have to do, is recognise the institutions have a problem. We kind of like teased it with the Stephen Lawrence inquiry when we had the language now to describe it, institutional racism. And then what has happened over the years is that the government, the media have rode back on it and trying to taken it out of our vocabulary. We have to push it back into the vocabulary. I mean, we're using structural racism, which is now a kind of like a new way of actually describing institutional racism. Yeah. It's exactly the same thing. We're saying that the institutions of state are engines of racism. So they might be, doing things like culture and media and all that, but racism is embedded deeply within. For us to challenge that is, first of all, using the right language. Be organising in a way that we can harm those that actually harm us. And that often means economics. When you're dealing with, it's like, I'm a parent. If my child was doing something really naughty, I could take away their toys. And then that would start the actions of them kind of like being corrective. Yeah. And then you get to a point where you don't need to take away the toys, even just the mention of taking away the toys, and then they don't want to be naughty. So it's a trajectory. With the state that are so locked into economics, the only language they understand is economics. So we have to organise to withdraw economics. Yeah. There's actually a positive side of that, because if you actually start to recognise your own agency in using your own financial resources to actually self-develop and for self-empowerment, that's actually a win-win situation. But we have to actively take away the resources. Some people can do that through ethical buying and ethical shopping, group collective buying. There's many various practices. And we now have a model that works. Because you see, whether you're religious, whether you're spiritual, whether you're apolitical, whatever it is, the lockdown has shown us that within a few weeks, you can inflict billions of pounds of dollars of damage on institutions that looked impervious to harm. The biggest organizations are feeling it. So we know that all this time, while we're being told that we are in a recession and that we had this, global downturn in 2008 and that people were hurting and we had to go for austerity, we know they were sitting on resources that enabled them to survive during all this time. And so they could have helped. I mean, they just chose not to. So we now know that actually, if we stopped buying at, Wetherspoons, for example. So if we just said, I mean, not saying that we are the clientele that for Wetherspoons, but if we stopped going to Wetherspoons or made it unethical or uncool and unhip to go to Wetherspoons, that institution, that's a commercial one, but that commercial institution would go down. If we replicated the actions of the working class with the poll tax riots, for example, if we just said, well, you know what? We're not paying our council tax. It's just not happening unless you're renaming the streets. It's really as simple as that. Those streets are going to be renamed. We are not paying our council tax until the police authorities or the police stations in your borough actually implement the reforms that we're calling for. That's going to happen. But it really requires a diverse movement. So you have some people dealing with the symbolism, which is the statues and the streets. But you also need teams that are specialists who are working on law and order, on health inequalities, on mental health issues, on education, on radical education and empowerment, and mutual aid organisations to fill in the gap where the state is just failing completely. You need housing. The biggest issue that we're going to have when we come out of lockdown, which no one's talking about, is rent. The majority of who are going to feel this lockdown the most are probably not probably, I know they are. My son is one of them. They're worried about rent. They're worried about being kicked out from their landlords when their tenancy agreement expires because they're falling behind in arrears. Now, what the government did, I mean, everyone's talking about Rishi and the furlough scheme, protecting all the workers and how magical he was with the magic money tree that they said that Corbyn was using. Just came out of the blue. So that's nonsense. We know now. But what they did, they protected the landowners. And I say that they protected those with property. So they had a mortgage freeze. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. What they didn't do at the same time is have a rent freeze. They stopped evictions, but they didn't stop that, and they could have. So again, you're seeing...
And generationally, this is like, hopefully people can see now that white supremacy underpins capitalism, the modern capitalism that we have. There's a whole generation now of young white people who are, they're not the target of this white supremacy, but they're implicated in the consequences, because they're probably the first generation, certainly in the last 100 years, who can't expect their standard of living to be any better than their parents. All the cats I saw throwing statues in the river, they weren't all black people. I think there's a lot of people who are just disgruntled with the state of capitalism and white supremacy that underpins it.
You're right. The whole model of neoliberalism, it's basically they've realised that it's actually a crock, and that actually they are being enslaved by the same system. Initially, many people were beneficiaries. So, I mean, if you had a European parent and, their assets, their cultural and financial and political assets shielded you. So you could be morally upright, but when push comes to the shove, you can go back to the bank of mummy and kind of get that down payment on the mortgage or on the house. You knew that, you can get daddy to call and get you a job or influence his networks to make sure that, you can kind of get progression inside the firm where you want to work. There were always ways. The system was always designed to look after you. But what's happened is that capitalism has gone into hyper mode. First of all, there's a bit of panic. There's panic about what the peril from the east. So China petrifies them. The idea that there's another economic power that they cannot control kind of makes them go into panic mode. The fact that there's fear, Britain's sense of impotency with the lack of its empire, the fact that we recognise that the Commonwealth is actually a perverse name for a collection of nations that have continually been impoverished. So Brexit was, the pandemic, all this was a perfect storm. And what I think when I see the Edward Colston statue coming down, I think it was something quite beautiful, that it was a multi-ethnic collection of young people who did that. I think that's quite significant because what happened there, where some of those protesters were shielding the brothers, the sisters, you know what I mean, with their bodies, is what should have happened when we talk about the BAME, so-called BAME report in the frontline services. They were shielding us with their bodies then. They were saying, you know what, we'll help you pull these statues down and put it in the river. So if they're going to arrest you, they're going to have to arrest us. That's the way we're supposed to move forward with those kind of issues. And they, what I believe, were taking the lead from us. For the longest time, anti-racist movements have been very well-intentioned, but they have been obsessed single-mindedly on this concept of anti-racism. And that actually is a problem for us. Because whilst, yes, racism underpins most of the problems that we're dealing with, specifically white supremacy, most African-orientated organisations are not anti-racist organisations. What they are health organisations, schooling or education organisations. That, you know, like all of the different gauntlets of inequalities that we face with, all of them are driven by an anti-racist ethos. And so when we focus specifically on anti-racism without actually looking at where we specialise in that landscape, what we're doing is actually trying to target something that can never be resolved. The human condition means that we're always going to have some form of bigotry around the universe. There's always going to be some people who feel better, some people who less. That's something that's always going to exist. It's a target that is always shifting, always changing. But things like health inequality, for example, those things can be addressed. The disability movement, I remember, there was a time, I'm old enough to remember when people with disabilities were called spastics. There was a spastic society.
Oh yeah, man, that was a primary school diss. That's what I remember them ones.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what happened was that with time, with education, we learned a different language. We can move from the medical model of disability to the social model of disability.
Yeah.
That if we actually put up ramps, like if you walk down the streets now, you'll see so many ramps and places making things accessible for people with disabilities. It wasn't the people who were at fault, it was the system. And so we have to think like that. Racism makes us very emotional, and rightly so. But when it comes to solutions, we've got to use that emotion to keep us going, but it's got to be sustainable. But we must be strategic and logical in the way that we take down institutions.
I wanted to approach something that I find really interesting in this context, and again, maybe cross-reference what happened in Westminster Abbey. I'm reading a book called Humankind at the moment. It's really interesting, a Dutch philosopher. It's a great book. But one of the things he's basically arguing is that we're probably essentially good, but a cabal of powerful, corrupt minds keep us with the illusion that without them we'd all kind of be stabbing each other, etc., etc. One of the most powerful things, and one thing that sets us apart as other creatures, from other creatures, is that we can blush, that we can feel shame, that we can feel some sort of sense of embarrassment. And shame comes to mind when I think of this moment now. Imagine how you must feel to come out from the woodworks and be like, actually, I represent the estate of Edward Colston and I want to fish him out of the river. How much embarrassment you feel, do you know what I mean? And in fact, where we are is because we have a political class of racist leaders who have no shame. Donald Trump, Boris Johnson. So I wanted to think about that a little bit. How is shame a useful way to mobilize the economic changes that we're talking about, the societal changes we're talking about? And how did you manage to overcome what I imagine were probably some residual feelings of shame? I'm imagining, if like my grandparents or your parents come from a community of West Indians or West Africans that are like, no, you have to love the Queen. You can't criticize the establishment. These little gremlins at the back of our heads that like, look how big Westminster Abbey is. You can't go in there and talk to white people like that. You know, how do you overcome the shame on the one hand and then mobilize shame, righteous shame on the other to get what we want, if you like, the change, the justice that we need?
That's an amazing question. I mean, it's actually artists like yourself. You are the weapon. You know, the Akalas of the world, the Stormzy's, the John Boyegas. I mean, you are the weapon. I grew up listening to a soundtrack. I was raised by a single parent, my father. And he raised me on every Sunday, like today, we'd be playing Fela around the house. We'd be playing King Sunny Addy around the house. So Sunday we always knew was our Pan-African Day. It was our Afrocentric. I didn't know the political ramifications of what Fela was singing until much older. But I knew the songs. I knew the words off by heart. I danced to them. We listened to them. We tapped them. We ate our food to them. The rest of the time, he was playing roots reggae. So even though we didn't have Caribbean heritage, that was part of our soundtrack in the house as well. And then on top of that, we had, and to my shame, yes, I'm familiar with all the tracks of the Beatles. I know ABBA. I know, all of that, as well as my Motown. So my father had an eclectic soundtrack that kind of like, but actually everyone has something to contribute. Everyone has value. So there's good and bad in everything. And that, first of all, kind of gave me a grounding. Like, even though I didn't know I was going to be a political adult, it told me that actually the world is more complex than the simple world, as it's explained to me in the school. That was a simple model that's given to the schools. So the first thing I learned to do, and it took me a long time, I'm not going to lie about that, it took racism to hit me in my life for me to do that. So I learned to create my own language. And so I became a musician for a short period of time. So for a decade, I was messing tunes, but I wasn't doing anything as great as you. My stuff was just party tunes. I mean, I'm just being honest. I didn't reach that level of consciousness. It was only when I actually went to move to Los Angeles with my partner at the time, my business partner, Jason. We was thinking about setting up a label over there. And then I lived in, I went to Los Angeles, I lived there for a little while. And I went down south, and then I saw what was happening to African Americans. And kind of like how Fela, when he left Nigeria and went to America, when I came back to the UK, I started politicizing my music. And all of a sudden, I couldn't get people to pick it up and sell it. No one in the magazines would review it. And I struggled to understand that. I was like, it's the same beats, it's the same chords, it's the same... What's different, Toyin? And I realised music. So, I mean, in answering the question, the first thing is that we have to start to learn a language. We had to learn a language so that even though we are bombarded with cultural media that's putting us in a position of shame, that we actually have a counter language. I mean, young people do it all the time when they're anti-speak, when they create new words constantly to assert their own identity. So, we were illin and now they're sick. Do you know what I mean?
It's so funny. I'll be one of them older heads that will say something like "nang," and that will put it. That's probably like 2007, 2008. Like, you're still down with the kids. It changes every 5 years, and if you're not,
So that's part of the weapon. So the part of the weapon is us actually empowering ourselves through culture. Forgetting politics for the time being, because everything is political anyway. But through culture and enriching ourselves. So we have a language. I never use the N-word. I don't even refer to us as black people. I use African. I mean, it's quite clear. And that way I avoid all the cultural constructs and the traps that are within there. African people didn't invent the N-word. We had no reason to invent the N-word. So there's no reason for the N-word to be part of my vocabulary.
And if it is... You're very precise, and you never really say slaves. You usually say enslaved Africans. Not the only person I've heard, but I really notice it as you describe it, because that in itself is another form of brainwashing through language, isn't it?
Exactly. No, you're talking about something I'm passionate about. It's like, you've got to understand, Britain was the criminal in this situation. They were in the role of the perpetrator. And so what they did is they created a language to normalize their behavior. So we had languages like plantation owners. When we're talking about enforced work camps where people were being worked to death, but plantation kind of gives this lovely connotation. You have phrases like, they were born a slave. Well, this is impossible. You're born free, and then you are enslaved. It's a process. But you see, me being picky, often, people think, oh, he's a nerd. And I am a nerd. Yeah. But what happens is that if we don't have our own language to describe those things, and to actually place it in the right, not even just political context, but ideological context, then we actually almost enslave ourselves philosophically. I mean, I know it sounds like it doesn't matter, but it really does. It's the reason why many of us say, oh, I'm going on plantation today. When we're talking about going to work on a job, you know the language we use and stuff like that, because we don't want to forget the history. So we encode all the injustices in our music, in our speech, in our food, in our dances, so that when we become ancestors, the generation that's coming have it as a repository to carry the fight on. And that's really important.
Strange psychosis exists in our language today, again through capitalism. I mean, planter. They didn't plant anything. They've literally forced by a barrel of a gun other people to plant it for them and stole the crops at the end of it. The madness of calling people planters, I think, is replicated today with property investors, engines of the economy. You basically mean you come and
grab a cheap property and force poor people to pay off the mortgage for you. That's not an investment.
Yeah.
And I think these same inversions are happening with language today, surely. You know.
That's right. But you asked the question about how do we get the elite who are shameless to actually kowtow to actually social justice principles. Well, you can't appeal to something they don't have. So if they are shameless, which we clearly know they are, you're not going to appeal to that. And so it's wasted energy to try to. But what you can appeal to is their overinflated egos. That is the Achilles heel. You see, because ego is actually, everyone has ego, and a healthy amount of ego is actually quite good for you. I mean, it gives you empowered to actually go out into the world and actually make change and, assert yourself and your identity. That's fine. But when we talk about people like Trump, when we talk about people like Bojo, when we look at the stats in Brazil, I mean, everywhere where we have an overinflated ego running the country, we're having this pandemic hit at its worst possible levels. So whenever that happens, what you do is that you recognize that those with huge egos have a weakness. They want to be loved. They want to be adored. They want to be respected. And they will do everything. They will manipulate everything to get that adoration. Now, they recognize that there's always going to be some people that don't like them. But what they don't want is that critical mass to tip the wrong way. I mean, I'm a complete nerd. I love Star Trek. And one of the things in Star Trek, when Klingons are being dishonored, what they do, they go, this is what I did actually in Westminster Abbey. People don't know this. When I spoke to the British monarch, it was my Trekkie, it was my nerdiness that happened. I said to her, like, you shame your nation. I said, that's it. I said, where the Germans have reparated and apologized for their crimes, you haven't done so. And in not doing so, you shame not only yourself, but you shame your nation. And then what I did was a classic Klingon move. I turned my back to her. It's like, kapla. And then at the Blair guy, you know what I mean? Yeah. And then I started saying, what's wrong with you? Yeah. Why is sorry so hard? So what you're doing is you're saying, I don't recognize your authority. It's kind of like, it's like prostration. It's the reverse of prostrating. I will kneel before my elders. I will kneel before those that I respect. But I personally, and the way I was raised to believe is that a dishonorable person cannot bestow honors. Yeah. And so the British monarch isn't my queen. I recognize her as the Queen of Britain, and so she is the British monarch, but she is not my queen. And hence, the idea of a knighthood and all these kind of trinkets is very problematic for me, because you have to be an honorable person to bestow honors. And obviously, the idea of going to meet my ancestors as a member of the British Empire, there's something spiritually very wrong for me. But I understand why people in their insecurities and kind of need for validation, it's a very complex issue that we have as a community, why some of us kind of like make those decisions. But that's my perspective. When we're dealing with people who have huge egos, you have to drain away the love. You have to, because then they get desperate. And in their desperation to get attention, they will actually try to appease you. And when they appease you, then they will upset their core base. And when they upset their core base, everything starts to go wrong for them. Yeah. It happens in the music industry. There was a lovers rock group called the Cool Notes, and everyone loved them. And I remember growing up, we were bopping to their music, and then they did this tune called "It's Never Too Late." And Never Too Late was a crossover. It was beautiful. It was soul. It was lovers. Everyone loved the tune. And everyone thought, Cool Notes, yeah, we love the Cool Notes. And then what happened? They had to follow it up with a hit. So they did another tune called and that's it, Spend the Night. Okay. And so in Spend the Night appeased the soul heads. So the soul heads went mad, come around and spend the night. But the lovers, man, they hated it. They hated it. And then they went one step too far. They were riding the crest. This is the Boris Johnson. And then they said, right, we're at Tottenham Pops, let's go for it. And they did In My Car. In My Car was a straight out pop tune. I'm gonna love you in my car. It was just nonsense. Sorry, I mean, no disrespect if any of you guys are listening, but just musically, it wasn't your roots. And so what happened? They lost soul heads, they lost their reggae heads, and the pop market was with them for a short period of time, and then they lost it all. You have to stay true to who you are. That's it. Experiment, cool. Collaborate, cool. Cross-cultural, working, perfect. But what makes us unique? Every single human person is our own self, our uniqueness, and how we interpret the world. The moment we try to copy someone else, then we become a dilute version of that other person. Yeah. And so the trick is, to get those people in charge, those people like the Boris and the Trumps who are trying to mimic what they think are strong men, we have to get them to become inauthentic.
Yeah.
What happens? Because then their vacuousness, their emptiness becomes exposed. And then all of a sudden everyone says, the emperor's wearing no clothes. Yeah. Why am I following this person? Well, it means we can't use the left and right politics. It's not as simple as that, because that's how they've been winning. The right is far better organised now at activism than the left. They know how to institutionalise their processes, whereas we often are caught on the back foot responding. We have to be assertive and recognise, and this is why I'm a Pan-Africanist, we have to say, what are we for, as well as we're saying what we're against. Yes. And right now, the West is still, the left is very much about what we're against, as opposed to what are we asserting for. And the right doesn't have that problem, hence it's in power and it has the machineries of state. Yeah. And we can't make the change we want unless we can neutralise the machinery of state.
And I think so much of this, thankfully, is being sort of done for us, a trial run of what it looks like without capitalism. They're telling us that the economy is really struggling. It's because they can't send us out to do those menial bus driving jobs, nursing on the front line. You know, so many of us just are refusing to or can't do those jobs that they need us to prop up an iniquitous economy. So you're right, I think there's all sorts of ways in which we're discovering that we have economic leverage, that we can withhold our capital, withhold our value, and just take a look at what the economy is really built on. It's all built on stilts. It's all the house of cards, you know?
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, right now, if we were living in a country that had a just government that was concerned about the well-being of its people, it would be saying there's a second wave starting in China right now.
Right.
They're doing regional lockdowns because what's happened, they've had months of no cases, and after, I don't know if you've heard, but they just started finding some new cases, and they've got a serious lockdown. They're petrified of a second wave. That's our early warning system. So we can say to ourselves, if we were living in a just society, and the government was actually concerned about the welfare of the people, it would say, right, that's happening in China. That gives us around a couple of months to plan for that. Maybe we shouldn't be relaxing so fast right now. Maybe we should make sure that the track and tracing is actually on point. But they don't care. That's the situation. It's the same thing like with Grenfell. Today we're talking, it's the anniversary, the third anniversary of the Grenfell massacre. And the tower blocks around the UK,
still cladding.
They're still got the cladding. They make all these lofty pronouncements that we've given £25 million and we're going to do so. They're still there. So the message that we've been told is quite clear. We put profit before people. And so the thing that I worry about, and I know there's a saying that the people get the government they deserve, there's an element of truth in that. If they are being so blatantly contemptuous of us and that we are still compliant and recognising their authority, then we do have some culpability in the... I saw a film the other day. I was a bit late to the table, called Peterloo. It's a beautiful, powerful film. And I get upset when I think, why do not more people know about this history? Culture, like I said, films, poetry, music, songs, all these are massive tools to educate. And so it disheartens me when I say these things.
Well, I'm working currently on a project called The Black Peril. I'm going to be telling a lot more people about it soon. But that looks at the race riots that happened in Britain in 1919. But that already should just floor people. The fact that there were enough black people to have race riots 100 years ago, and why don't we know about it? But then Peterloo is the one 100 years before that. So it's almost like soon after a war, the Napoleonic Wars in that case, or the First World War, people start agitating for a better life. And the establishment are like, no, we're going to call the cavalry in, we'll split them up, we'll divide them along racial lines, anything to stop that sort of recognition from catching on, that contagion from catching on.
So currently I'm researching activism in East London, and I'm looking at it from an institutional perspective. And during my studies, one of the things I found out is that there's been a trend of what I call activism to be pursued in a mode called faddism. And faddism is really where you find out that a cause is taken on and people are very passionate about it and they kick all the resources into it for like maybe a month, maybe 3 months at the most. And then they get bored and they move on to the next cause. And it's kind of like a buffet of activist causes. People just dip in and out of these causes. And so if you think about the trajectory, when I started my research in 2017, so 2016, Black Lives Matter was the big thing. Everyone was talking about Black Lives Matter. And then what happened? Trump came in 2017, there was the Women's March, and so all of a sudden, the issue of racism was pushed to one side, it was just kicked to the curb, and everyone was talking about, well, actually, the Me Too movement, and this is the other issue, I mean, the Me Too movement was actually started by African-American women, so the racial concept of that movement was kicked to one side, and it all focused on Harvey Weinstein. And it's not to say that obviously, that was obviously a worthy cause, but I'm just saying what happened was that it became a fad again. So the original cause, which was based from an issue of dealing with African-American domestic abuse, then became sanitized. It was almost like gentrified. It was a gentrified piece of activism. So that happened. And then after that happened, then we saw the movement to the ecological issues, which are very important. We saw things like the Extinction Rebellion movement take place. And so what I'm saying is that there's a trend in activism right now. I mean, where you're seeing massive amount of resources going into worthy causes for a short period of time, and then people get bored, switch off, and dip into the next part of the buffet. And what happens is that the original problems are still there, but they're starved of the oxygen of media attention. They're starved of the oxygen of resources to keep motion going. So what's happening is that they're no longer sustainable. And so the activism that's taking place right now, even right now, is ethical, but it's the only thing that has made it sustainable is the actions of what's happening in America deliberately with the communities themselves organising to make it long-lasting. And what we saw in the UK with people like Stormzy taking money out of his own pocket to make it sustainable. That is something we have to address. Activism that is not financed for the long term, for the long haul, is a fad. It actually risks harming the movement, because that's what happened to Black Lives Matter. When everyone took their eye off the ball in 2016 to start protesting about Trump, because we can do those things simultaneously, right? We just chose not to. When we took our eye off the ball and started focusing on Trump, and then took the eye off the ball and started focusing on Harvey Weinstein, and then took the eye off the ball and started focusing on just ecological issues, or, that was, I would say, almost unethical.
Yeah, and this segues perfectly onto the last question, actually, because you're right, we're on the anniversary of Grenfell, and it puts me in an interesting double bind, because I hear exactly what you're saying. A lot of these other peripheral issues are a way to marginalize, almost invisibilize the original black injustice that was faced. But I also, from my readings, am really aware that the first degradation of the soil and environmental degradation on an industrial scale, or on plantations in the West Indies, or in the appropriation of the New World. So understanding the ecological disaster we're in, you have to understand white supremacy at the base of that, at the root of that. Misogyny, modern misogyny, not just in ancient cultures, the way it looks today, homophobia, transphobia, these are actually things that there's an anti-blackness, an anti-African thing at its core. That's the origin of it, and it's just another way to marginalize and divide people. So I'm aware on the one hand that this white supremacy is at the root of all these other intersectional demands for justice that we have, but then I'm wanting to ride for those. I want to get behind Greta Thunberg and the LGBTQ activists that recognize that the system is ugly and it's supposed to alienate us. But I don't want to diminish and invisibilize black suffering. You see, it's like a tightrope that we're walking on. Maybe for people that can't quite get it, explain how COVID, Grenfell, and Edward Colston, do you know what I mean? They're all interrelated. They're separate and connected issues. Does that make
Well, you articulate that. No, it does. You articulated it quite beautifully. They are all interrelated. And I mean, I refer to, as a Pan-Africanist, I refer to the original sin. That's what's not being resolved. The original sin of enslavement. Because I have a firm belief, if we fix the issues as a society that underpin what leads to moments like now with Black Lives Matter movement, then most of the other issues will be resolved, because it underpins everything. But I understand that, as humans, we get bored. We work on something for a period of time. We want newness. Newness has been the plague of marriages and all kinds of relationships with with everything, essentially. TV programs, we want something new, we want something different. And that hence the reason why fascism exists. So my approach is quite simple. I say that if someone is really sincere about being involved in social justice movements, then they take the approach that happens when you go to uni and you take a major and a minor course. So you say to yourself, right, I know that I'm interested in all of the injustice in the world, but I can't deal with them all. So I'm going to pick a major one that underpins who I am. So that might be dealing with sexual inequalities or gender inequalities. And my minor course might be dealing with causes of racism in the health system. And there you go. What happens is that you primarily work in field one, and then when you kind of need a break from that, you work in field two, and then you go back and forth. If everyone took this approach, then what happens is that no active movement will be left behind. But what happens, the media and social media's amplification of media concerns is so pervasive, it's so powerful, that when everyone says, right now, we're going to talk about the statues, and the right-wing media amplifies that through posters and TV and debates on the toxic radio stations, then everyone shifts to that. And then all the original activists and those who are actually harmed by the causes, they're just, they're invisible. And that's it, we don't see them. So we have to be a bit more sophisticated. We have to recognize that it's happening, and then have countermeasures to defend against that. But no one should feel guilty. I mean, if someone says to me, look, I'd love to do something about racism, but I'm an expert in the inequalities in the transport system of people on low incomes, well, I'll say, well, do your stuff. And then when it intersects with us, let's do something collaboratively. We're not in competition. And that is the biggest trick of, as far as I'm concerned, is that we are programmed to think in a sense of competition, as competition is good, greed is good, all this kind of nonsense. Where the reality is, what we need is a world that's based on collaborative actions, collaborative movement, thinking, sharing, and that is a big shift. That is a huge cultural mind shift. Even the sports that we watch are all competition based. Someone has to win. Even when we get our grades, if someone's getting a first and someone's getting a 2-1 and then someone's getting a 2-2, everything we think we program is in a competitive manner, which means that we have internalized this idea that we are going to be somewhere on the ladder, rather than saying, well, no, let's just turn the ladder sideways and get rid of this whole hierarchy business. And that takes radical education. There's no simple way of doing that, about demonstrating it, not through words, but through actions and practice.
Powerful, man. We're not donkeys. We don't need carrots and sticks. We're human beings. We don't need those stupid incentives to get on. We can actually model a new way of doing stuff. I'm really excited about that. Toyin, thank you so much for giving me your time and thoughts. As I said, that action that you did 13 years ago already was so powerful, it left an indelible impression. When people ask me what are the most significant political events of the last 20 years, that definitely is one that figures in my mind, even if it's not in the popular consciousness, because it was an example, much like now, when you get to see people's real colours. When Tony Blair's sort of moonwalking away from the question of saying sorry, and when you see the reaction of the media. Moments like these really do bring things to the surface before that we didn't even know were there. And I'm excited for all of that.
Definitely. I'm looking forward to your project, this film project. That sounds
the Black Peril is going to be incredible. People can check out legally.org, right? Still?
That's right.
Website. The YouTube channel, they've got incredible content there as well. So more power to you, brother, and everything you're doing. Hope to actually catch you in person when this lockdown thing is properly ended. You know what I mean? And stay strong, man. Thank you.
Likewise, and thank you for inviting me. And take care. Peace.
Yeah, an incredible interview. I hope you agree. Lots of constructive suggestions for how to break the system, how to choke the system, in the words of a track I just dropped. Make it impossible for them to profit somehow. Take away their toys. It's a good analogy of being a parent. You take away their toys and the behavior quickly corrects itself. Change the language that we use. Be careful about how words like born a slave, etc. can re-enslave us. Fascinating. Shame. Use shame to shame these leaders. They might not have much shame, but they do have an ego. They do have pride. So how can we rip that currency from under them, especially when they're not who they say they are? How can we look for overlaps with other connected, related struggles, but avoid faddism, faddish, faddery, and faddism, where stuff's just, available for a minute and then we forget about it and move on to the next. How can we develop staying power, really? And I like his analogy of a major and minor degree. How can we fix the fundamental issue, which in all of this, even white supremacy and racism, the core of it, the motivation was money. So it's impossible to I think to some extent race and class are indivisible. Lots of lefties like to say, well, class overrides race. No, it doesn't, because the very concept of class goes back, predates the Industrial Revolution and goes back to what was happening on plantations. That's a fact. I've just frozen. And how can we disrupt the classic 3-day media window where a story is only really resonant for half a week and then everyone sort of moves on, loses concentration, the sort of ADHD that we're encouraged to have as a society. We need to have sticking power with these issues and with these ideas. But yeah, man, keep your comments and your likes and so forth coming. Do share this if you're on Facebook. One of the residents of Grenfell who started off the lockdown today, basically exhorting us to not pay our rent if our landlord isn't delivering on the things that we demand. If the places that we dwell aren't habitable, then we shouldn't inhabit them anymore. If the jobs that we're doing aren't fruitful, rewarding, and if they're a danger to our health, then we just don't go to work. If those shops that we wasted our money in before aren't doing anything, then don't go back to those shops. I think I've got it here, but I want to play just one more clip before I end on a song. And this is from the classic Today program.
It's about
one of the fragrances.
It'll certainly be a different shopping experience. The Star acknowledges, but as the Mail says, people must overcome their fears. They must hit the dying high street. The Sun tells its readers that buying a new gadget or a pair of shoes might not feel that patriotic, but by splashing a bit of cash, they'll be breathing life into Britain's flatlining economy. For the Express, it's not just about spending money, it's about what we want the high street to look like a year from now.
Whoa. So you heard it there, right? They're basically saying, and why are the Sun and the Telegraph and the Star and all these newspapers so animated about getting us back to work? Because their entire business model is based on advertising. Without people shopping and wasting their money on fraff, then these dead rags, frankly, that have just enslaved our brains for the best part of the century will just dissipate. They'll just vanish. That's why they want us to go back to work. Why do these shops, why do these high street department stores and stuff need us back? Well, because we don't make anything as a country. That's what the economy is now. Tertiary sector, consumerism. And in case you hadn't worked out, people didn't like or enjoy enslaving other human beings and had to develop a whole complex hierarchy of race to justify it. But the engine was consumerism. People just loved that sugar and that rum and all of the byproducts of sugar and even if it gives you gout and obesity. Consumerism, that buzz, that rush that you get from clicking on a mouse and buying something online or going down to the shop, that's an addiction that needs to be nipped in the bud because it has all sorts of unforeseen consequences and leaves us with a world designed as it looks today. But it's been a lot. Thanks for being with me for this hour and 25. Got some great people coming in, some friends of mine, school friends and otherwise chums as part of it. Do remember you can share this once the broadcast is finished. And do give me some suggestions. I did mention in that the Black Peril is coming soon. Now, a lot of you will know that this is already a released album. So what do I mean by it's coming soon? I'm going to make the first announcement right now, but something that's really, really exciting is that, please mark it off in your diary, between the 14th and the 18th of September, we're going to have a Black Peril Festival. It's going to look completely different to, I guess, the way that shows and festivals have operated pre-lockdown, pre-coronavirus. We're going to be going to a lot of site-specific places, exploring this history in a lot of detail, and with a carefully curated cast and crew of musicians, dancers, etc., having interventions and responses, improvised responses to the history of race riots that is at least 100 years old in this country. So mark those dates down, the September the 14th to the 18th. I'm going to be giving you a lot more information because I'm fleshing it out as a project even more. If you've enjoyed these live streams, imagine this, but with sound that works and without echo issues. It's going to be so slick. So yeah, watch this space for more information. Do share this. And I'm going to leave you with a piece from the Black Peril. One that I kind of like playing quite a bit. You probably heard me if you tuned into previous shows, rocking out to this. This is Revival Time.